All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Lunch and Learn session. I'm Joe Watson. I'm the Carolyn Caudell Tieger Professor of Public Affairs Communications. And so we're going to talk about probably one of my favorite topics, but not necessarily everybody's favorite topic, which is talking about political discussion in the classroom, in the collegiate classroom. Let me begin by just asking for a show of hands. How many of you guys feel very comfortable having political discussions in the classroom or in large group settings? How many people feel a high level of comfort? All right, that's not very many people. And that is not at all unusual, and that's kind of the point of it. I'm kind of an anomaly in terms of actually enjoying that. I could ask the same question about how many of you guys are comfortable discussing, faith or religion in a classroom, and I'm sure I would elicit a similar kind of response, meaning not many. And I see people recoiling already in fear at the prospect of talking about some of these things. So I want to talk about this today and why we have that sentiment, some of the challenges that we face in academia in terms of having these conversations in classrooms, and then offer a model or framework, which is not my own, for how to facilitate these conversations, and finally conclude with some of my own pointers for how to do it. Throughout, feel free to raise your hand or interject questions. You guys all know me, so I'm used to you accosting me or asking me things. So feel free to jump in at any time if there's something that you want to call into question or ask me about. But if you'll bear with me for a moment, I'm going to adjust the AV. I always like to start with a video clip, and I've got one kind of teed up here. So let me see if I. All right, so anybody who knows me knows that I love science fiction, fantasy, and all that stuff. So I'm going to start with this. This is one of my favorite moments from Star Wars, as the kids will call it, Episode 5. The older amongst us will call it The Empire Strikes Back. It's the film that introduced us to the character of Yoda. And anybody who's seen Star Wars knows that Yoda does nothing but provide wisdom throughout this film and all the other films. So let's start with some words from Yoda.
We'll never get it out now.
Always with your word cannot be done. You do nothing that I say.
Master, moving stones around is one thing. This is totally different.
No different. Only different in your mind. You must unlearn what you have learned.
All right, I'm going to try.
No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try.
So I love this reference, Yoda, and I always come back to it. This notion of you must unlearn what you have learned. We've been conditioned with a lot of things in terms of what is appropriate for us to talk about and what is not, and what is dangerous and what is not. And part of embarking on the notion of having conversations about political topics, about elections, is we have to unlearn some of those things. And some of those things are there for a reason, but a lot of it we have to unlearn. So we're going to start with a conversation about what exactly is the third rail. I call my presentation here, Touching the Third Rail, Thoughts on Facilitating Political Discussions in the Classroom. How many of you guys are familiar with the nomenclature of touching the third rail? Okay, you've heard of it. And the association with it, I kind of did research in it because I was actually curious about it. The etymology of it, so the definition, according to Merriam-Webster, is a third rail is defined as a metal rail through which electric current is led to the motors of an electric vehicle, such as a subway car. So if you've ever been to a big city, gone to the subway, you see that third rail, if by some unfortunate circumstance you should find yourself on the tracks, you definitely don't want to touch that third rail because there's high voltage power going through there. But it's evolved from the 1980s to also encompass any discussions of a controversial issue that usually is avoided by politicians. The person who coined the term is a gentleman named Kirk O'Donnell, who's chief counsel of Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill during the Reagan administration. He actually had a wonderful career, but this is something that he's famous for. And he said, and it was published, I believe, in a New York Times piece, Social Security is the third rail of American politics. Touch it, you're dead. So that's where it comes from, this notion of Social Security is a particularly vexing issue and nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to think about raising the retirement age or raising taxes to pay for it. It's like, just stay away from it. It's political death, just avoid it. And so in America, we've used that term to apply to anything in which it's a particularly perilous conversation, something that could yield very damaging consequences. And we extend that to our personal conversations about politics, especially in the workplace. And for us as faculty, we're in the workplace. And so we don't want to do things that are going to jeopardize our employment or anything like that. And we've all seen recent conversations about the decline in protections for tenured faculty and academic freedom and freedom of expression around the country. And so we're always mindful of it, and even if we're not, concerned about, employment consequences, we're also concerned about bad press and visibility associated with it. I recall the most recent example I saw, and you guys may have remembered this, but did anybody see the story about a professor at Carnegie Mellon following the death of Queen Elizabeth? Anybody see any of that coverage? So Diane saw it. Yeah. So there's a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon who articulated. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I don't want to touch on a sore subject if you're a royalist. So it basically said, something to the fact of, I'm trying to paraphrase, but something along the lines of, I'm not sad about it, and I think maybe even wishing a painful passing or something like that for the Queen. And it was just like stories everywhere about it and just all over the place. And a lot of us don't want anything like that. We don't want to say something that's going to result in a tweet about, oh my God, can you believe somebody said it, and see a story in the paper and have to defend it. And so a lot of us have adopted an approach of just avoidance, of just not doing it. And I want to talk about that. And I also want to talk about how in academia we reached a point where talking about politics at all has become something of a third rail. So how did we get to this place? How did political discussion in university setting become the third rail of academia? Well, first of all, we're in Georgia right now, and so we have to be honest about the fact that we receive budget and resources from the state of Georgia, and the state legislature has to approve that, the governor has to approve that. And so there's a dichotomy between public and private universities here that we have to be honest about and recognize. Individuals at public universities are in a very different context than those that are in private universities in some respect with this. And so that's part of it. There's always sensitivity if you think that behavior or statements might actually impact promotion and tenure, or impact budgets, or impact any kind of thing like that. And so you want to be mindful of that. So that's one thing that's going on that I think it's made it challenging. Also, we've seen, and this is not a particularly new phenomenon, but we've seen conservatives increasingly using academia as a political foil, kind of someone to beat up on. We've seen that with a lot of other roles. We've seen it with the media and the press. We've seen it with lawyers, trial lawyers, things like that. But academics and academia have also become that. And so that also puts us kind of a bit in the crosshairs. Then you have the 2016 election, which was one of the more emotional elections that we've experienced, both the campaign of 2016 and then the actual election results that impacted, particularly impacted academic communities in a very deep way. And a lot of people were especially at a loss with how to talk about the election cycle itself, given the strong feelings and the emotion, the high emotions there. I think there's, the imagery of like the woman crying after the election results that everybody's seen, and just the raw emotion of it. And so that's another source. Like, man, I just want to stay away from that. I don't want to be anywhere near that. But then mostly, and this ties back to my reference to Master Yoda, we're taught from a very early age to avoid these discussions. I can still hear in my memory my father telling me, and I'll paraphrase and omit the profanity, but my father telling me, boy, don't ever talk about politics or religion. Like, just don't ever do it. And much to my father's chagrin and disappointment, I've done nothing but, as everybody here knows, those are my two favorite things to talk about, perhaps because they're so dangerous and taboo. But we're taught to avoid it. We're taught that it's impolite, that it can, create discomfort. And so that's probably the biggest barrier that we have, just getting past the sheer discomfort of it. In a moment, I'm going to talk about why it's worth it to do that. And then we'll get into a conversation about techniques and things like that. And then I would love to get questions and hear what you guys think. But there's something that I think is worth visiting here, which is a demonstrative fact, which is that in university settings in the United States, we've had a real decline in conservative and Republican faculty. I mean, if you go back prior to the 1960s, you had probably more substantial, more equivalent partisan representation. I mean, you had a number of individuals who self-identify as Republicans or conservatives. But when you get in the 1960s and 1969, it just starts to drop. And today, those numbers are just really, infinitesimal. So here's a table that shows a number of studies, and it basically asks individuals, faculty at large universities, how they self-identify. And so the first study, finds, and this is what's interesting. In economics departments, that's the lone place where you'll find a significant number of individuals that self-identify as conservatives. But even in economics departments, that still only is maybe a third at most of faculty. When you get to political science department, it's far, far less. In philosophy, history, literature, sociology, you just see, when you look at the Rothman and Lichter study, you see single-digit levels of individuals who identify as conservative. So that's a decline. That's a number that changed from decade to decade. Why am I pointing that out? I'm pointing that out because that's a reality that we have to address, because it means that most of us that are in the position of having to have these discussions do not necessarily resemble, that academia no longer exactly resembles the population at large. And that makes it a little bit different. And certainly here in Georgia, and I know a number of you guys we've talked about in classrooms, our ideology and our students may be very, very different. And that's a reality. So we have to be aware of it. And it's a departure. It's a decline. It's a shift in number. The encouraging thing is we've had incredible, strides, and obviously more work to be done in terms of increasing demographic diversity. But in terms of ideological diversity, we've had a severe decline in ideological diversity. So that's the reality that we have to address in terms of just being honest about part of why we have the challenges. And the outside world understands that and sees that. Certainly, folks in the political world see it. That's part of why we're such an easy foil and such an easy target. But students also have this perception as well. So should we discuss it? Well, the reality is that political discussions can be fraught, but they're double-edged swords. They're double-edged swords. There are perils, but there are also real heuristic benefits. For me, I'm very intrigued by political discussion, because I always think about instruction through the lens of case studies. I think about what are particularly rich sources of case studies. And I mean, you don't have to go too far into, a newspaper or information or news of the day or whatever to just see how much rich content there is in terms of our areas, in terms of either journalism, advertising, PR, even entertainment that's completely touching on politics. And so to avoid it means we kind of deprive ourselves of the ability to have conversations about it through the lens of heuristics, of actually helping students to learn how things work or don't work. So that's one of the things. The other part is we really are always looking. This is the merit of the case study. We're always looking to provide a bridge between what we're studying and what's happening in the real world. And again, what's happening politically is a very vital bridge, and it's something that they can just see, happening in the real world. And I always remember, as a student myself, I studied political science. And I can never understand why, in hindsight I know now, but I can never understand at the time that something really interesting would be happening in the news or whatever, and I would get to class and it'd be like, that just didn't happen. It would be like it was never talked about. And I would go to talk to faculty after and say, hey, so I saw this, what does that mean? But it was never talked about in my classrooms. And so when I elected to do this, I kind of made it a point that I wanted to have those conversations I didn't have when I was a student myself, in part because I want to bring the real world into the classroom to help explain the merits of what we're actually teaching and how it connects to reality. The last point in terms of why I think it's incumbent upon us to have discussions about politics is because increasingly organizations, you think about brands, are expected to have engagement on these topics. The era, I say this over and over again, the era of sitting by the sidelines for major brands, major corporations, major organizations just saying, hey, I'm just here to sell Coca-Cola. I just want to sell soda. I want to sell sandwiches. I want to take positions on this stuff. That time is over. And so the students who leave our college and go out into the world are going to be in organizations where they're under increasing pressure to navigate these channels and figure out, like, how do I talk about it? Well, if they don't learn how to talk about it in a classroom setting and they're scared to talk about it in an like, how are they possibly going to talk about it with external audiences if they've never modeled how to have constructive conversations about it? And so that's why I think it's so important for us to take that risk so that we can help best prepare them to be able to do that. So that's my long-winded preamble. So thank you for patiently going to preamble. So when I was preparing for this conversation, I talked to my wife about it, and I said, I kind of want to do this, and I don't know, people are going to think it's weird or crazy or whatever, which is most of what I think. And she's like, yeah, it is weird, crazy, but it's true. And so I kind of thought about how I modeled my approach to instruction, how I modeled the approach to it. And I kind of reflected upon being a kid and the information that I consumed and why I kind of feel the way that I feel about things. And I grew up in Chicago, and my mother, who was a lovely, lovely woman, watched this show incessantly. And the show was shot in Chicago, and I think in the old CBS studios in Chicago on the north side. Anyways, it was a show called The Phil Donahue Show. I hear laughter. So I have to confess, I have loved Phil Donahue since I was like a little kid. I don't know how anybody could not love Phil Donahue. But the thing about Phil Donahue is that Phil Donahue discussed issues that everybody was terrified to touch. It was the first time anybody talked about sexual orientation and people understood what that meant. Or during the HIV/AIDS crisis about what was happening there, and had honest conversations about different perceptions about race and gender and all these different things. And so as a little kid, I'd be in the living room with my mom watching this, and I kind of like soaked it up subconsciously. I was not really conscious that I was emulating Donahue in any way. And I probably do a very poor emulation of Phil Donahue. But it was just the notion that he had somehow managed to crack the code in terms of getting very different audiences, and his audiences would be all over the place on an issue. Some of them would be very antagonistic one way or the other, but nevertheless, the Phil Donahue show never degenerated into like the Jerry Springer show. Like it never degenerated into like fisticuffs or any, there was never anything like that. And I think I just was always greatly impressed with his ability to kind of come in here, bring an issue that made everybody uncomfortable, but have a conversation that was actually somehow both civil and instructive, and have people walk out of it with a different way of thinking about issue than they entered that conversation. They opened themselves up to learning and appreciating different perspectives. And that's how I approach talking about political discussions. I mean, one of my tips I'll get to at the end is I'm not really having this conversation from a framework, and nor do I suspect any of you would be, to try to change minds or win a point. I really want people to understand their different perspectives and what that means for whatever it is we're trying to instruct them on. And Donahue provided a wonderful model. So I found this article, this journal article from 1984. And it's entitled, Phil Donahue, an Excellent Model for Leading a Discussion. And it walked through all the things that Donahue did in a systematic fashion. So one of the things that Donahue did was he would study the issue before the program. I translate everything into class references. But study the issue beforehand. Don't walk into it not knowing about it. If you're going to talk about a particular political race or particular political ad or something that's going on, actually do a little bit of homework on your end first before you bring that case study into the classroom. So first, study the issue beforehand. You're always in a better position to moderate or facilitate a discussion if you have superior knowledge or information. So you always want to have a position of having more knowledge than the participants do. So that's your goal. You gotta know more than they do. The second point is he would always start with a presentation of the issue. He would always set the table before the discussion began. So he wouldn't just like open it up and just like people just start firing off at each other. He would articulate the case and the issue to the audience. And he might take, maybe 1 or 2 minutes or maybe a few minutes kind of just like spelling out what this is. And that would lead him into introducing either a panel or going directly to the audience. But before he ever elicited any comments from a guest or an interviewee or the audience, he always provided the background. I liken it to those of you who have been involved in public opinion research. If you've ever done a focus group, part of what makes a focus group work is you have a focus group facilitator, and they have a discussion guide, and they kind of lay out the assumptions and everything first before they get the input. So that's exactly what you're trying to do in this context as well. The third thing, relax the participants. This is another focus group tip. I mean, you want people to be relaxed. You don't want people to be like all ginned up and all uptight. You got to relax them. And Donahue was masterful at that. That was probably his greatest gift, that people just felt at ease somehow to share things that they wouldn't otherwise share with him. But you have to make sure your audience is relaxed because you really want honest comments, and you want to list that from them. You're not going to get that if they're not relaxed, if they're guarded in some way. The fourth point is very important. This is the thing that is the greatest barrier for our students in terms of having these discussions. That is embarrassment, okay? You have a bunch of people who are, college age, undergrad, graduate students. They're all relatively young, writ large. But nobody wants to embarrass themselves. They don't want to embarrass themselves to their peers. They don't want to be subjected to judgment from the peers or from us as faculty members. And so we have to take pains to not embarrass them for saying something, even if they've articulated something not particularly well or somehow in a not very artful fashion. We have to really avoid that. We have to be mindful of how we say things and the fact that could impact them in that way. Because the minute that happens, it's kind of over, because then everybody's going to clam up. you got to keep the discussion moving. So you've got to keep it moving. You got to move around. If things start to lag, you got to kind of propel it forward, and you know, that's important. This is one that I really think is also important that I like doing, and that is, you know, as I tell my students, you know, I have students come in and they will talk about their resume or something they're always concerned about. I don't know if I have enough experience, or if they're saying something like, you know, I don't know if this is a good question or not. And I said, like, look, nobody expects you to like think like a 40 or 50-year-old person. You know, you're an undergraduate student, okay? So if they say something and it's not quite right or it doesn't come out quite clear, you know what it is, I would restate it for them so that it is presented in as clear and coherent a fashion as possible. Or if I see somebody taking what they said incorrectly, I'll say, you know, hold on, I think what the intention really here was to say this or that, and clarify that so that you avoid miscommunications and misunderstanding because of language. Again, I don't expect somebody who's 20 years old to be as disciplined and exact in language as somebody who is our age, okay? This one is difficult. This one is the most difficult for me, and that's to prevent anyone from monopolizing and going off on tangents. Well, first of all, I'm the king of tangents, so I can't really judge people from going off on tangents. But the monopolizing is tough because we all have students who are very vocal, who are very comfortable, and those who aren't. When I was in law school, we called them gunners, and we just resented them greatly because we would sit in the back not knowing what the heck was going on, but there's always like one person just was always whatever. So you have to share the wealth a little bit. So you have to, you know, make sure that you're going around. This you guys already do from classroom in general. This is a general teaching thing. But you don't want anybody monopolizing it. One of Donahue's tricks, and Jim actually had a hand mic, you know, for when we get to questions or whatever, is, and this is one of the tips of like moderating when you have a microphone, is you never let go of the microphone. So you put the microphone to someone's, you know, in front of them and say, okay, here's a question, and then you like take it away, you know what I mean? And so that's one of the techniques that he used on the show that I was amused by, but he never let go of that microphone. For us, it's more challenging because we don't have a physical microphone, but we have to be willing to like cut someone off or say get to the point, or say, do you have a question or what's your conclusion, to move them along and kind of discourage that monopolization. This one is another sensitive one, and this one, along with the embarrassment, is a source of concern with students, which is we want to encourage people to share, in Donahue's world, it's feelings. In our world, it's opinions or perspectives or thoughts. We want to encourage that. I remember in classes where, you know, we would have people, they might espouse the most radical of concepts or whatever, and it was always important that you not like shoot that down, but just kind of like, you know, just let it be expressed and say, okay, so you're saying whatever, but we want to encourage that and foster that, and sometimes it may lead to things that are not always ideal, and we may want to push back or ask follow-up questions to tease out, well, why is that? And, you know, it also leads into the next point a little bit, but we want to encourage that. We want to encourage that. We want them to feel comfortable doing that, and that means that we can't really hammer them if they say something that we find disquieting or not congruous with our own thinking, which leads to humor to lower attention. You know, so I was teaching a class a couple weeks ago, and I had a student in my program, and he kind of said, he's like, man, like I hate the government, you know, and I kind of said, I said, like, well, tell me what you really think, you know, because I'm not really, really, you know, tell me what you really think. Are you really giving me your honest, you know? I kind of you know, joked with him about it, and we had a conversation about media as well, and I said, so which do you hate more, the government or the media? Like which? And he's like, oh, it's a tough choice for you, you know what I mean? But the idea is to make light of it, but also to be probative about what's underpinning that. Why do you feel that way? The truth is, if somebody's articulating something like that, they're probably not the only person who thinks it. There are probably other people who think it and won't articulate it, and so I think it's beneficial if you have someone articulate something that's out there like that, to actually understand why they have that. And for others who don't have that opinion, to understand why they have this very, potentially distressing perspective on the world. And so we want to tease that out. Humor is really important. And again, humor goes with the relaxation, that if you use humor, you reduce tension. It's okay to laugh. I think part of the reasons why our national discourse is so problematic right now is because we really don't laugh about anything anymore. We just treat everything like it's just utterly deadly serious. And I can't recall ever having a class where I didn't laugh about something, even if it was a serious topic. I mean, I think it kind of, it's the old adage that, you have to laugh or cry sometimes. I prefer, I'd rather laugh than cry all the time about things that I don't like. But humor is really important. Humor makes people comfortable, and it also allows them to interact with each other better if they don't really take everything seriously. I mean, there's some thoughts. Think back to yourselves when you were in undergrad. I can tell you there are things that I remember articulating in undergrad or grad school that I wince at now. I have friends that I've said, it's hey, what, do you remember when you said this or that? I'm I never say. He's you for sure you did, Joe, say that. And I said, oh man, I don't really think that anymore, But, people are still formulating their thoughts and they're still refining things. And this is where they come to do that. And so we want to probe them, but as I like to say, we always want to allow room for growth for people, and so we have to always keep that in mind. It's not all fully baked just yet. So, and then ask good questions. Again, if somebody says something, ask them a good question. Ask a follow-up question. Give them that room, but don't let someone articulate something and not defend it. The price of articulating an idea is being willing to defend that idea or that position. That's not an unreasonable thing to request. And so I always ask good questions. Say, well, why do you think that? Or do you think that's really right? Or what, what's behind that? Or how do you think that actually works? Or let's play this out. But ask them good questions to make them actually think about how they're getting there. Make them maybe question how they reached a point. That's something that's very important, and obviously something that Donahue did well. So that's kind of my writ large framework, and the framework I would suggest is Phil Donahue's framework for how we approach it. I do have some personal tips and things that I encourage for you as folks who are involved in classroom instruction. And so mine are: find good role models and emulate them. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. I think, as long as we give credit, I think we should not be afraid to steal approaches and things that work. This is one of the things I encourage my students to do. I say, if you see campaigns doing things that are really good, steal it. Don't steal it if it's working, steal it, And that's the same thing for instruction. So if you observe things, whether it's in an academic context or another context with presentations that you think is particularly effective, use that as a role model, emulate those things, and don't be afraid to do that. Everybody's going to have a different comfort level and different things that work for them and for their individual styles. So part of your search is kind of finding that. Jeff, you'll appreciate this, but it's like with music as a guitarist or something. It's you look at it and you're like, I want to kind of emulate that. I'm not going to sound exactly like that, but that's going to be something that's going to put me on the right path to how I want to do it. So find that. Use humor again. I can't emphasize that enough. Keep it light. Keep it moving. Keep it light. Master the facts and prep topics and subjects. You gotta be in control of the facts. You can't engage in a conversation like this and not have your facts straight as the faculty member. You have to have mastery of that. Here's one that I really think is important, and maybe one of the sources of concern that we have, which is our own thoughts and opinions. This is because we're taught to keep it hide. Bury it deep, don't show anybody this. Don't hide your thoughts or opinions, okay? Everyone here has thoughts or opinions. Everybody here has some form of bias. We're human. We all have it. Maybe we don't necessarily always like that we have it, but we have it. We have to be honest about that. We can't hope to elicit honest perspectives and honest discourse from our students if we ourselves are not willing to share that. Now, obviously, you want to share that within reasonable bounds, but don't conceal it. And again, this is one where levity and humor can play back and back. There are some political figures that are kind of like a running source of jokes for me. There are people who I think are just very ineffective communicators. It's not purely ideological, people I just think are just not very good. And it's just like a running joke. Everybody knows that I have a low opinion of this person or the other, but I don't conceal it. I mean, I'm very honest about it, and I'm willing to explain. If somebody asks me, well, why? I'm like, well, here's why. And it's okay if you don't agree with that, but that's my perspective and that's my opinion. I think students find that refreshing because I think they are just kind of surprised that somebody actually gives that up. But I think that's important to do if you're comfortable doing it. Don't proselytize. The worst thing you can do is to proselytize and try to convert. This is not the place for conversion. This is the place for discourse and exchange of ideas. It's not the place to proselytize. And so, even if I'm asked things, I'm always leery of doing anything that leads to me kind of projecting my values or things like that into like, you should think this or you should do that. I find that very uncomfortable. And part of it is that I'm very resistant to proselytization. Like, there's no sooner way to like turn me off than to come in and say, hey, can I like whatever? I'm like, absolutely not. Like, now I'm going to go do the opposite thing, So avoid that. Question assumptions. This is important. This gets to kind of like the individuals with kind of like very strong views or views that we find, that are maybe, at some level of extreme or whatever. Question like, what's under that? Like, what are your assumptions? Like, why do you think that? Or I'm just curious, like, can you tell me more about why you think that or what your, how you've gotten to that perspective? But question it and kind of pull pieces away from that so that not just you, but the other individuals in the class has a greater understanding of where that other party's coming from. And then this one is probably the most difficult, but encourage empathy. That's really hard. That's kind of like a value thing, I guess. But you got to encourage empathy. I teach in my class, in my advanced class. I've been doing it for a number of years. I don't know if any of you guys ever saw the documentary on Bobby Kennedy for President. Anybody ever see that documentary on Netflix? It's a great documentary on Netflix. I make my advanced students watch it whether they want to watch. I just say you got to watch it. But I share that because, Bobby Kennedy is a political figure, and like 1960 and are two completely different people. And he just transformed. And there are numerous stories of individuals who have evolved and achieved different things over the course of the. And so I always want to encourage people to be empathetic and give people room to grow and to change perspective and not like hold anybody's feet to the fire. Again, we're not lawyers in a courtroom trying to cross-examine somebody or trying to impeach a witness or anything. We want to encourage empathy and let people remember that, what you think today may be different 6 months from now or a year from now. And so we should try to have a little empathy for someone who maybe is not where we are, where we think they maybe should be at a given moment in time. So I encourage that, but I demand respect and civility. And that is one where, as faculty, we have to serve as, enforcers in terms of not allowing anything to generate in which there are instances in which there is a lack of respect or lack of civility. We have to ensure that that is non-negotiable. If you can't maintain that, you can't do it. And so that's kind of the table stakes for the discussions. So those are my tips. It's my setup and my background. I'd be happy to take any questions or share any further thoughts, but thank you for your patience. Thank you. Questions? Dr. Hume. Wait, the mic. We've got the mic coming.
I'm going to hang on to it so you don't
Remember Phil Donahue, Sarah. Don't
yes,
so you've already let go of it.
So this has been awesome, and I agree with you 100%. I think sometimes my problem is we're in an era of misinformation and disinformation. How can I, without embarrassing a student or squashing their participation, handle a student that is basing this, what they're saying, on things that simply are not true?
Well, I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, my personal favorite senator, who said that individuals are entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. We can't allow people to manufacture facts that are just not true. I think we have to be a little bit diplomatic in terms of how we confront them on that. But I think if somebody is citing something that's that's specious or just not true, I think we have to just say that's not true. I've had similar conversations, by the way, with adult peers who've kind of been on the phone, and I'm just like, yeah, that's just not true. I me's just, it's like, I respect you and you can come to whatever conclusion you want, but that's just factually, that's just inaccurate. It just is what it is. But I think you have to push back on that. I also think in terms of when I have discussions like this, I try to encourage, I do try to point out, I kind of point out that to a certain extent, this gets into a more complicated thing, there's an element of political news information that's driven by clickbait and done as sensationalized, where it's really more entertainment than news, from certain outlets. And I just want people to be aware of that. I'm like, you just need to be aware. People out here trying to make money, entertain you, and that's not necessarily giving you reliable information. So make them aware of that. But I also do try to steer students, regardless of ideology, to what I consider to be legitimate outlets. I say, look, we're very fortunate in the United States. We have a great, newspaper, in Georgia, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who does great work. We have great local papers here in the state. We have great national newspapers, not as many as we would like, but, we still have, the Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, depending on your particular flavor, your particular, preference. But to me, I try to direct people to those sources, or even news magazines that actually do good work, to encourage them to consume that information without kind of condemning the other outlets. I kind of say here are the only ones that kind of I've curated that I think are very consistently good. So I try to direct them away from those things. I also think it's important to habituate students to consume good information from good sources, because that's going to let them participate at a higher level. Carolina, and then,
Okay.
yes.
Funny thing, but I was once in the audience of the Phil Donahue show.
Were you really?
And actually, I did ask a question.
Yes.
He did this to me.
Did he hold
But
on to the
that's
mic?
a
Did he-
Yes, he did.
I told
That's
you
a
he hold on to
different-
microphone
It's a story to be told another day. But
Okay,
I know exactly what you were talking about. But the question I have is this. So my students, and I teach mostly public relations students, my students are excellent students. They're very driven, but they're very scared to fail. They're very scared to, say something that maybe, Dr. A is going to think that I am, or whatever. So what I do is that I take it very gradually. Mm-hmm. So the first few weeks, I don't touch anything on that third rail. I do other things. I try to make them feel at ease, realize, and then little by little, I start bringing some of these things, because this is part of, as you said very well, reality and all that. But you, Joe, you teach classes that have to do with political discourse, and I want to know how you do it. Do you jump in from the beginning? Do you also wait, like I do a little bit, until they realize Dr. A's classroom is a safe space? How do you do it?
So first of all, I think you do a phenomenal job, and I think you're excellent, and I think your approach is exactly right with that audience. My makeup is a little bit different. When they come into my class, they're choosing to enter into a form in which that is the norm and participation is expected. I'm of the mind, I kind of like to jump in. I like to jump into it. Now, it takes them a while to warm up to it, I think, and there is that trust issue. One of the things that I try to emphasize, and I do this not just with discussions with students, but I do it with discussions of anybody, because I have a background in which I spent time, in Washington doing stuff like this. And so I'd have some people, I remember having a conversation with somebody, my son's in Cub Scouts. It was a Cub Scout meeting. Someone's like, well, I probably haven't followed this as close as I should, Joe, or whatever. I said, dude, you're taking your kid to Scouts. You should, you're normal. This is not abnormal to not have fully evolved opinions on every nuance of everything. That's actually normal. I'm the outlier, And, but I also try to emphasize with students at an early point that everybody's opinion and perspective has value. It all has value. Just because I've been in school longer or I'm in the front of the classroom doesn't mean that your opinion about a given issue is inherently more or less meritorious than mine. And so I try to make that clear. I try to create an egalitarian framework in which people can push back and have different opinions. So I try to kind of diminish my role as kind of being, the ultimate barometer of this is kind of where you should land, and allow them to say, no, it's cool. It's cool that everybody's kind of all over the place. And I'm all over the place, and I've been wrong on things and made bad calls and done this and stuff too, so that they're more comfortable. I also think that one of the things that I find helpful that I didn't list here is self-deprecation to a certain extent. If you've made mistakes or done things wrong and you share that, they love that. I mean, and my son, nobody loves it more than my son. My son will ask me stories tell me when your dad got mad, whatever. I'm like, do we really have to rehash this? Because I still have the scars from it, But I think if you share that, that's a way of kind of leveling the playing field so they're more comfortable doing that. But I start right away. I'm not quite as skillful as you are at trying to do it gradually. I kind of rip off the Band-Aid right away and just jump into the deep end. But I also think it's okay, with students that just are not as comfortable or not as political. I also say it's okay that not everybody should be a hard partisan. It's okay to be this is interesting, but I don't really have dug in feelings about it. That's okay too. In fact, that's probably more normal than those of us who are on the other side. Thank you.
I think my question is about the last point, the idea of encouraging empathy but demanding respect and civility.
Yeah.
Do you ever encounter, or are you ever concerned that while you can do that in the 75 minutes while you have them in person, we live in such a digital environment and they have group me's for the class, and maybe you can put out the fires during class, but that it might spill over into their digital lives, and there may be a chat going around within the classroom about something that was deemed offensive or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the peril of the digital age in and of itself, that, it's rife with miscommunication and things that may not even be intentional. So that is very difficult. One thing we try to do is to formulate, and this is something that goes more to my program than to general approaches to instruction, but try to create a sense of community within the classroom, that if you're part of a community and you know each other, you're less likely to kind of take wild swings at each other if you kind of know the person. I think part of what fuels a lot of the toxic behavior is anonymity. And so I try to strip away the anonymity of ideas. That's why when we have people have discussions, I would say okay, where are you coming from on this? I mean, I want them to publicly state. I want them to state it for others to hear. I want to strip away the anonymity. And I think that my personal diagnosis of a lot of that is if you don't know somebody, if you're in a group meeting, you're like, okay, who is this person? And they're able to say that. But it's if you know each other, it makes it a lot more difficult to do that. So I try to facilitate, and this includes, addressing people by name and, treating them with respect, and things like that, and addressing them. I mean, in my class, if I don't recall someone's, surname or something, I'll always call them sir, ma'am. And I address my students as sir, ma'am, as much as I can. Again, to try to demonstrate that level of respect that they should have for each other. I try to model that. I think Dodie had something up front.
Give me that mic.
I'm just curious if you've noticed any difference in the emotional temperature of the students post 2016, pre-COVID, pre-January 6th, because my sense, and it is just a sense, is that people are more willing to die on their hill than they were before, and that the gaslighting as a first line of almost defense, as opposed to articulating reasons for why you think what you think. I perceive that that is a little more amplified now, but it's just my perception, and I wondered if you noticed that at all, and if that has changed at all how you deal with some of these conversations.
Well, I will first say that I think that it's a very good question. I think that in particular, presidential election years really bring out a lot of energy. So that's the first thing. I would also say that this is one of the most difficult things and this is the thing I think that makes the whole notion of public affairs and political discussions so difficult, is it's very emotional. It's very emotional. People have a lot of emotions tied to it. That's why my dad told me not to talk about it, because he knows people have very strong emotional attachments to a faith tradition or to a political affiliation or whatever. And if you try to poke at it or something, you're going to get an emotionally charged response to it. So it's a very delicate thing. So I think that I certainly have seen the charged emotions about it. I generally, this is kind of like Dr. Hume's comment as well, which is like sometimes people come and they're like, hey, they present misinformation or they gaslight, do things like that. I think you kind of have to push back on that and not let it stand. And so I always try to push back on it when it evidences itself. But I've seen it more ebb and flow around particularly contentious issues that are going on at a given time. I remember, for example, distinctly, when we were debating, when there was debate about the Kavanaugh nomination, that was one of the most toxic charged times I personally remember being in the classroom where people were talking about that. So I think a lot of it turns on what's going on and how how strident and dug in the different sides are. And that goes for elections too. And I think, 2016 or 2020, there was some, like that when you have the presidential elections. So I see it as more a factor of either a big issue or big political debate happening within the country at a given moment in time, or there being a very significant election going on at the time driving. And I could say the same thing about the first Kemp-Abrams race. There's a lot of energy, a lot of highly charged thinking about that one too. So I've seen it. I don't know. Every group is a little bit different, and so I don't know if I would say that I see the trend going in a different direction, at least for students. I certainly, outside of the classroom, with our peers, absolutely. With our peers, I absolutely see it going in that direction, and you could see the curve just, I wish my portfolio, whatever, my retirement fund went like the direction that this is going, you know what I mean? But that's how it's going. But I don't see it as much for the students in terms of that continuous trend like that. I see it kind of more spiky. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, one moment. Got the mic coming for you.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a graduate student. I had a question about translating the ideas of humor and relaxation into really monumental events. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of events that are pretty alarming or very serious, like the insurrection of the Capitol, for example.
Sure.
So how would you take an event like that and pose it with humor, or so that your participants can still be relaxed?
Well, I think that you kind of nibble around the edge. I mean, I was on Capitol Hill for 9/11. I don't tell 9/11 jokes. You know what I mean? There's certain things that are just really you want to stay away from. But there are little areas to nibble around with it. And I kind of joke around things around the periphery if I can, or things that I find are humorous, things I find particularly ridiculous that really happen, and kind of make light of that. I have, I remember is it documented that it was in the lead up to January 6th. There was a moment in which Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican leader in the House, was on a call with Republicans, and my friend Adam Kinzinger, who's a congressman, kind of said to Kevin, he's like Kevin, like I think we really need to like do something to diffuse this. I think this is going to be really bad or whatever. And like Kevin was like whatever, Adam, or whatever. And I just thought it was really funny because he basically treated Adam. I mean, it's funny, but it's tragic. But he treated Adam like a kid. And so you can find humor in those things, even if you kind of view the tragic consequences. At least I can, but I kind of have probably a very dark sense of humor about the world. But everybody has a different style and a different tone for what's humorous, but there's no shortage of things that are humorous happening out there. I mean, all you have to do is watch a comedy program or something to see comedians who like make light of all kinds of things and are able to do it effectively. So, but I do have to say that, there's an old definition. I don't know if you guys remember the formula for comedy, but tragedy plus time equals comedy. So you never want to joke about something that's too proximate in time or too sensitive still. But tragedy plus time, you have enough years passing behind it, you can kind of make light of things more. I remember I do a case study in my class where I talk about Nixon's toxic relationship with the press when he was in the White House. And at one point in time, Nixon, there's a wedding, his daughter gets married, in the White House. And there's a moment where Nixon finds out that someone from the Washington Post is like covering the wedding. And Nixon brings his chief of staff in and like basically reads the guy the riot act and says like there should never ever be anybody from like the Washington Post in the White House. Like no one. I don't care if it's to talk about flowers. I don't care if it's about the wedding. Like nobody ever. And do you understand this? I mean, Nixon's just like chastising him. At one point, Nixon's like, and like, by the way, like I will fire you too. You know what I mean? It's like if there's a Washington Post here, I'll fire you too. He's like, well, okay, sir. Yes, I understand. And I mean, it's hard not to laugh at something like that, as insane as it is. But it's like really funny, this notion of somebody like basically about to fire his own chief of staff for having somebody at the White House like take pictures of wedding photos, of wedding floral arrangements or something. So, but again, it's far enough in time that most of people in your class were not alive when Nixon was president or even when Nixon was alive, and so it's far enough in time that you can kind of poke fun at some of these insane things and kind of get the message across and lighten things.
We got one more question back here, then we'll have to
Okay. Please.
This
Those are
is
the
so
best ones.
interesting. I want to add two things. Like one is something I do in my class. It's
Please.
intro to reporting.
Yeah.
So I try to do some data journalism where they create their own data sets. So they create a survey, and one is political affiliation. And it's super interesting to see, number one, the shift.
Yes.
And I think it's great for them to see, oh, look, there are people like across the spectrum. My question is this. So I have a couple of students in my class that I know are concealed carry.
Okay.
And I have talked about things. Sorry, I know it's a good last question, right?
Yeah.
This feeling has come up that when certain things are talked about, as we do like a news, what's the news of the day, that there's some restlessness because people feel strongly and it's a large class. How does anybody deal with this specter of amendment in the classroom? Happy Wednesday. Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've talked very openly in my class about Second Amendment issues and debates, and I can't think of a time where there's been a mass shooting that we haven't had a conversation about policy and approaches and debates and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I always kind of come to the point in my class of working with my students and say, like, how would you evaluate the efficaciousness of messaging on gun control, given that we've had decades since we've had meaningful gun control legislation passed? And by the way, I don't even consider the last bill real meaningful gun control legislation, honestly. So I'm very open about it. I take that approach now. I mean, I kind of don't really spend time thinking about that or if somebody's carrying, perhaps because I grew up on the south side of Chicago where people had open carry way back upon a time, so I don't probably think about it very much, but I know it's out there, and I think everybody has to modulate things for their own comfort levels. with that. And certainly if you had concerns about it, I would certainly keep the temperature low. But I've never been concerned about that. Thank you. No, thank you.